Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Carrie Heller. Today we're going to talk about anxiety. What is anxiety? In some ways, it almost feels funny to have to define anxiety given how common it is. At the same time, it's really important to do so because people experience it very differently. Anxiety refers to nervousness or worry about something. Sometimes the concerns are very realistic. Things like, am I going to get laid off from my job? Which, if your job is making, cuts or you're doing a terrible job at your job, probably could be very realistic concerns. Other times people can have fears that are completely irrational. I'm going to get kidnapped, or I'm going to get run over. And again, in some cases, theoretically, depending on what you're doing, I guess that could be realistic. But in most cases, there's also sometimes people experience anxiety of things that just are so unlikely to happen. But it was interesting how anxiety forms, because if you think about that someone could be really anxious about all these things that are completely irrational, but yet things like walking down the street and being worried about tripping and falling on the curb. Most people walk down the street at some point, and yet people could be anxious about all of these things that are so unlikely to happen, yet they're not anxious about potentially tripping on the curb. Not that I want you to have anything else to get anxious about, but the idea is it's interesting how anxiety even develops in the first place and sort of how it manifests. In terms of how anxiety manifests, there's, tons of different ways of how it manifests, and each person is different to some degree in how it's visible. Probably some of the more common ways that anxiety is present is in the idea of excessive worry or rumination about everyday things. So constantly thinking about things that are bothering you, or you're worried about the future of, this is going to happen or that's going to happen. Other times it's the idea like a feeling of just general uneasiness, and sometimes not even being sure why you're anxious. And that can in itself can sometimes even be worse. The idea that you're anxious, but you don't actually even know why. Because at least if you have an identifiable trigger, while it still may not feel comfortable, at least sometimes that almost makes it easier to address in the moment, but just not knowing in itself just makes people more anxious. Impaired decision-making can be another way that anxiety sort of manifests itself, either sort of causing it or kind of the result of it. Reduced concentration. Sometimes people do experience physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, and even nausea. And I think with anxiety, one of the other things that's also sort of challenging about it is you have the anxiety itself that comes on and then creates its whole set of issues of not being able to get stuff done that you want because you're nervous, whether you're worried about it being perfect or you're so anxious you just can't even start something. And then the other problem, one of the other problems, is then sometimes people often experience, feelings of guilt about having the anxiety in the first place, or shame or other negative feelings as a result of having the anxiety. So then it just kind of spirals and makes it even worse. But the good news is there are lots of different options and a combination of things that can be used to help treat anxiety and make it much better. In terms of treatment of anxiety, for things that are really mild and are just coming up as, once in a while, I'm a little nervous about this, probably there's some simple things you could do at home to try to make things better. But if the anxiety is really impacting you on a regular basis, that's where oftentimes a combination of professional assistance paired with other things you could be doing at home on your own can be helpful. Probably some of the more common ways of addressing anxiety would be, one is formal behavioral treatment like psychotherapy. There are just several different forms. One of them that's quite common is called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. Medication is another one that's often used to treat anxiety, especially chronic anxiety and, when it's quite severe. But, in general, it's, for some people, medication can work extremely well. It's, everyone's different. So you just want to look at, for each person, which strategy is going to work best. Other ones that are often helpful are, depending on what the anxiety is about, working through or addressing underlying issues causing anxiety. So, for example, low self-esteem or things that are more deep-rooted, or obviously sometimes those can be exacerbated by anxiety, kind of a back and forth thing, which is not fun. But, with that, then that's where sometimes, more of like a psychodynamically oriented psychotherapy or exploratory process, or if there's other tangible ways of addressing whatever the issues are that are causing the anxiety. Other things, if it's, let's say, cosmetic, if someone is super anxious about their appearance for some reason, if there's something that you can do that, if someone, let's say, has a gap in their teeth that they're really self-conscious about and that makes them super anxious in social situations, if that's something that could be fixed, then potentially that is one way towards managing the anxiety, make it better. So there's different, you have to look at it from a holistic perspective. And then in the moment, various tools you can use like mindfulness or breathing exercises to help yourself to calm down when you're feeling anxious. Because a lot of times, when someone is really anxious, their heart may start racing, they may sort of start feeling really tense, they may sweat excessively. And so all these things are physiological signs that you're anxious or stressed. And that being said, the fact that people experience the physical symptoms is another way of illustrating how very real anxiety is and how problematic it can be for a lot of people. The other sort of, I guess, category, or one final category of treatment approaches, is just general healthy lifestyle habits, which are probably really good for anyone, but things like getting enough sleep, a healthy diet, enough physical activity. All of these things, again, while they're helpful for everyone, can be especially helpful as an extra method towards offsetting issues caused by anxiety and minimizing anxiety. The goal of this episode is to give you a basic overview in a very informal way of what anxiety is, and a basic sense of some ways of treating it. I realize there's far more we could talk about as far as in-the-moment tools and other things like that, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of what our main goal is today. So I hope this is helpful in giving you a basic sense of anxiety. Certainly in future podcasts, I can definitely go into more details about specific tools and things like that. If there's stuff you'd like to hear about on the podcast, feel free to send me an email at appt@hellerpsychologygroup.com. And I'm more than happy to, if it makes sense, it's something I'm capable of or that I feel comfortable talking about, I'm more than happy to, do an episode on that particular topic, and try to be helpful. So, feel free to reach out, or you also follow us follow the podcast on Instagram at Being the Best Version of Yourself podcast. And until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Kerry Heller.